1 minute countdown to the start of the news conference. 1 minute countdown. Thirty seconds. Good morning and welcome to today's news conference. Chief of Police James Raymer will be addressing the media on the Toronto Police Service's race-based data collection strategy findings and next steps. Chief Raymer is accompanied by Colin Stairs, Chief Information Officer, Deputy Chief Kim Yendor, and Dr. Mai Fan, who is a race data expert consultant. They'll all be available to answer questions regarding the strategy, process, and data. Chief? We're delayed by 2 minutes, just 2 minutes to start.
Are we good?
Go ahead, Chief.
Okay, good morning, and thank you for joining us here today. First, let me say that due to the importance of the topic of systemic racism and the complexities associated with it, my comments will be longer than usual. This morning we released findings detailing the analysis of race-based data collected in use of force and strip search interactions. The results have confirmed what for many decades racialized communities, particularly the Black and Indigenous communities, have been telling us, that they are disproportionately over-policed. This data demonstrates the unfortunate realities of those experiences. As an organization, we have not done enough to ensure that every person in our city receives fair and unbiased policing. And for this, as Chief of Police, and on behalf of the service, I am sorry and I apologize unreservedly. The release of this data will cause pain for many. Your concerns have deep roots that go beyond the release of today's report. We must improve, and we will do better. In 2019, through the Anti-Racism Act, the provincial government directed that all police services in Ontario begin collecting race-based data in instances of reportable use of force. The purpose was to assess whether racial disparities exist in policing, and if so, what can be done to eliminate them. In recent years, we have been grappling with addressing and rooting out the complexities of systemic racism, as have many other institutions. We recognize that when a person has an encounter with the police, it can have a profound impact on their life, their mental health, and their trust in policing. It is for this reason that the Toronto Police Service must be a driving force and a leader in eliminating all forms of racial discrimination in policing and anywhere it is found. It is a reason we must engage the communities most impacted as we continue along this journey. We not only welcome community voices and insights, we recognize that it is essential to identifying ways to reduce and eliminate disparities, measure and evaluate improvement, and continually look for ways to live up to the goal of equitable policing. You deserve better, and our members deserve better. The Toronto Police Service and the Toronto Police Services Board embrace this opportunity to eliminate discrimination. The Board's commitment to doing better and the policy it put in place with input from senior leaders of this organization demonstrate how governance and collaboration between the service and the Board can lead to positive change. In implementing the policy, as a first measure, the service committed to collecting and analyzing data not only in relation to incidents where officers use reportable force in the performance of their duties, but we also committed to do the same with strip searches. With the release of the initial results of this important and ongoing work, I recognize that today will be a difficult day for many within the service and within the communities we serve. It is difficult for the Toronto Police Service because our own analysis of our data from 2020 discloses that there is systemic discrimination in our policing in these areas. That is, there is a disproportionate impact experienced by racialized people, and particularly those from Black communities, when there is a use of force interaction with the Toronto Police Service. For example, members of the Black community are 2.2 times more likely to experience an enforcement interaction with our officers. They are also 1.6 times more likely to experience force once involved in an enforcement action. My fellow command officer, Mr. Colin Stairs, will provide a more detailed account of our findings in the coming days when this information is presented to the Toronto Police Services Board on June 22nd. He is also here today, the entire team is, to field questions you may have. As challenging as it is for me as chief and for members of our command and service to come to terms with what our data tells us, I know that it will be even more difficult for those from Toronto's Black communities who have been telling us for many years of their experiences. And I want our communities to know I am listening. I also acknowledge the impact systemic bias on Indigenous communities in Toronto. We know that their specific experience and the history of policing that is so intertwined with that experience has left our organization less trusted by members of Indigenous communities. We are not seen as the true partner for community safety that we are and want to be. We know that this is a role that must be earned as part of the journey together. We are committed to achieving equitable policing for all our communities. We cannot do this alone, and we must hear from you. As challenging as our findings are, this day presents an opportunity for us to be and to do better. In fact, because our legitimacy is tied to public trust, it tells us that we must be better. On behalf of my command, as the leaders of this organization, we take full responsibility. We have often heard from communities that apologies alone are not sufficient, and we agree. It is also our responsibility to identify the systems and procedures that are causing or contributing to the disparate treatment of racialized people and to address it head on. We will do all we can to fix this. And some of this important work is already underway. I can report that we have already created a comprehensive system for the analysis of this data that goes beyond what has been mandated by law, that lives up to the board's requirements of us, and we are further expanding the data sets that will be subject to this analysis. Use of force and strip searches are just the start of our work. Over time, we will collect race-based data arising out of other types of interactions so that we can learn more and take the same approach to those interactions. That is, determine if there are disparities, work with our community partners to understand why, and to identify concrete actions to correct any wrongs. We have gone and will continue to go beyond our mandated scope of work out of a sincere desire to understand the extent to which systemic racism has led to differential treatment by our service. As we said in the earliest stages of this journey, we could not fix what we did not measure. I know that some I know that some say we could have and should have acted earlier, even without the data. I assure you that we are now fully engaged, and we now have a way to measure the success of our efforts, to eradicate racism. I want to recognize the role of those in the Black community who have been pressing for change, often with personal sacrifice. I acknowledge that their commitment and persistence has played a key role in getting us to where we are today. I can confidently say that the approach we have used reflects the best practices for race data collection. It exemplifies what communities have asked of us, and it adheres to leading practices and the anti-racism data standards. We have used careful statistical applications to achieve an advanced level of objectivity and measurability. We have invested much time and effort in this endeavor, and we will continue to do so. We analyze what is happening, test theories on why it's happening, and then test our reforms to measure the difference they are making. And when I say that we've gone beyond what was mandated, we haven't simply compared our use of force incidents and strip searches against population census data. We've gone a step further and calculated the data in relation to the number of contacts various groups have actually had with the Toronto Police Service. In so doing, we can more accurately measure the outcomes that result from our reforms. Our goal is to focus our efforts on the systemic bias attributable to our actions, the actions we can control. We believe this is the most reliable path forward for us to measure the outcomes of the reforms we have identified together with our community advisory panel, and that this approach will ultimately benefit our communities who are experiencing systemic racism. When we commenced this work in 2020, our intention was to get it right and go beyond what was asked and to set the standard. I believe that our approach is accomplishing this. I have witnessed the careful, deliberate, and collaborative systems our race-based data team has developed and have confidence in their approach. Our work has been peer-reviewed and is supported by the opinions of two recognized experts in this field, Drs. Lauren Foster and Les Jacobs. Their independent report reviewing our approach was also released today. I encourage everyone to read that independent report, which states in part that excuse me, the TPS RBDC strategy reflects the best practices for race data collection from a human rights perspective and is a model for other police services in Canada. As difficult as these findings are, we recognize that this is some of the most important work we have ever done. Getting to this point with our data has been challenging. We were committed to using the 2020 findings as a baseline to build upon actions that have already begun and will continue in the years ahead. I want to thank and acknowledge the engagement and contribution of our community consultative groups, including the Race-Based Data Community Advisory Panel, the Police and Community Engagement Review, also known as PACER, the Board's Anti-Racism Advisory Panel, and ABLE, the Association of Black Law Enforcers. You have held us to account, and we thank you for your candor and commitment to continue to help us address this multifaceted issue. It is critically important that you inform our work. I am truly inspired by the commitment of our advisory bodies to working with the service in repairing and enhancing the community trust that is vital to community safety. We would also like to recognize the renewed collaboration with the Ontario Human Rights Commission in their important and ongoing inquiry into systemic racism in policing in Toronto. The Ontario Human Rights Commission has been a key partner, and its policies and reports have been one of the sources from which we have drawn in developing our actions for the way forward. We believe that our work and our findings, as presented here today, will assist us in continuing to work with the OHRC and with all communities to develop effective strategies that address the fact that bias and racism in society is impossible to deny, but must never be seen as inevitable or acceptable. Indeed, we must denounce it and eradicate it. Before I move on to address our next steps, I want to take a moment to address the members of the Toronto Police Service. This data analysis speaks of systemic racism, not of individual acts of racism. Individual acts of racism are of course misconduct and are dealt with as such whenever they rear their head. There is and will be no tolerance, absolutely no tolerance. Racism has no place anywhere in society, and it certainly has no place in policing. This data analysis demonstrates that we have not done enough as an organization to combat the systemic underpinnings that can then help you to do your work free of bias so as to instill trust in all the communities we are sworn to serve and protect. I want you to know that this is an organizational shortcoming, and it does not speak to your actions as individual police officers and civilian members. But we, each and every member of this service, should find the information released today difficult and uncomfortable. It may in fact lead you to reflect on your role in policing, and understandably so. That said, I believe that our membership has never been more committed to progressive and inclusive change at all ranks and positions, both sworn and civilian. Together, and with the support of the board, let's use this as a watershed moment to redouble our efforts to eradicate racism in all its forms. You are uniquely positioned to help this service implement the changes needed. Finally, and arguably most importantly, the question turns now to what the service is going to do about what we have identified through this data analysis. As always, we are committed to continued engagement with our members and communities as we expand the types of data we collect and analyze and co-develop our responses. Through this first phase of our efforts, we have, in partnership with our community advisory panel, identified 38 action items that will be implemented. These action items are in line with our other reform initiatives currently underway, including the implementation of the board's 81 recommendations on police reform, the implementation of the 151 recommendations flowing from Justice Epstein's missing and missed review, and our soon-to-be-launched equity strategy, designed to embed a human rights approach in the very fabric of all that we do as a service. Each of these initiatives demonstrates the commitment of the Toronto Police Service and Toronto Police Services Board to meaningful and lasting reform. Our progress on these 38 action items will be tracked, and we commit to keeping the public, and in particularly our communities most impacted, aware of our successes, as well as when we need to adjust based on what we have learned. You can find those action items on our TPS website. Without prejudicing or prejudging the results of the OHRC's current inquiry, I believe that many of these action items will align well with many of the OHRC's recommendations. With this entire body of reform work, we are taking the initiative and building a continuous improvement cycle. We will proactively and openly engage the community in exploring our data to seek new ways of making the service a more equitable one, and to eliminate the bias that our systems cause, perpetuate, or augment. A key priority as we continue to do this hard and important work is to identify discrepancies, not only based on race, but more generally in the delivery of policing services across the city. An individual in one part of Toronto deserves the same approach to equitable and human rights-centered policing as a different individual in another part of the city. As we move forward, we will be looking at how to develop criteria to evaluate and ensure all levels of the organization, across the organization, are meeting the standard of performance expected and deserved by our communities when it comes to bias-free policing. To see the outcomes we all want for our members and for the communities we serve, we will continue to implement change in our own organization, and we will actively advocate for change in the broader ecosystem in which the police operate. We are also aware that reconciliation is a part of this process, and we will commit to working with the communities on other meaningful initiatives that will assist in achieving that goal. In closing, this is a continuous journey of reform. With the culmination of this first phase of race-based data, we have only started our journey of measuring to understand, to repair, and to improve. On behalf of all members of the Toronto Police Service, I commit to continue driving this change with leaders across our organization. I speak not only for myself, but for the service I have the privilege to lead. This service and the board that governs and oversees it has put in place an unshakable foundation for real and durable change that will combat systemic racism, an approach that will persist regardless of who holds the position of Chief of Police. The board is also committed to this objective and to taking concrete steps to eliminate racial bias, promote equity, fairness, and non-discriminatory police service delivery in Toronto. We will continue to listen, engage, and act, all with the goal of propelling us forward in our ultimate goal of providing fair and equitable policing to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. We're now going to take questions. As explained earlier, we're going to go to media who are here in person first, and then we'll go to WebEx. You'll get one question and one follow-up. When you're called upon, if you can access the mic to the right-hand side, then please do so. If that's not possible, then please speak as clearly and loudly as possible from where you are. If you could also indicate who your question is for, so Chief James Raymer, Deputy Chief Kim Yendor, Chief Information Officer Colin Stairs, and Dr. Mai Fan. First up, we have Paula from Canadian Press.
Good morning. My question is for the Chief. 2020 was kind of an anomaly in terms of, well, many things, but also in terms of policing. Crime rates indicators were down. We can probably, I'm assuming also that police interactions and enforcement were also down. Can we then extrapolate that this is actually a much worse problem than this data suggests?
No, actually, 2020 actually, despite the pandemic and a slower period, there was a considerable amount of police activity. I mean, some of our calls, yes, were down, but I think the analysis actually breaks down the data in a very, very effective way. And I think from our perspective, it is really sets a baseline for the organization. That's a very positive one. I think in terms of the very specifics of the data, though, that's something I think perhaps Dr. Pham could answer better than I can.
Thank you for the question. We did break it down by month, and we do see the effect of the first state of emergency that was called in March in some of the trend lines. But things returned to normal over the course of the rest of the year. And when compared to 2021 data, for example, arrests, there were the same amount of arrests, if only just slightly less in 2020 compared to 2021. But it's comparable, and I'm confident that despite the unusual year that 2020 was, it does reflect what our patterns have been, at least in the near future, current state.
And I mean, as a follow-up, I guess, you've said that this data will not be used to discipline or assess individual officers' performance because there are already kind of systems in place to address any misconduct. But doesn't this data essentially show that the systems that you have in place to deal with individual acts of racism from officers are inadequate?
No, well, actually, first of all, pursuant to the Anti-Racism Act and then ultimately the board's subsequent policy, the investigation here is about systemic racism. So that's what we're trying to correct. And in fact, the data, when analyzed, is anonymized. So, so really, now what's happening is we've developed a baseline which is going to allow us to correct. It's going to allow us in consultation with our community to develop policy, to test that policy, change the policy, and see where we're going wrong and where we're impacting communities differently. From the issue of discipline, as I've indicated in my comments, over racism will not be tolerated. The membership of this organization will not tolerate over racism. And there's many ways to actually address it. To address it internally with our own professional standards, members can go to the OIPRD. Community members can go to the OHRC, and there's also the avenue within the courts. So there's many opportunities to address overt racism. This is about identifying the issues within this organization that exist in other institutions as well that are creating unfair and inequitable systems.
Thank you. Next up, we have...
my name is Beverly Bain. I'm from the No Pride in Policing Coalition. And I'm here to address what I see as really egregious in terms of this particular a public relations stunt that has been delivered by our chief here, the Chief Raymer. This has nothing to do with the black community. In fact, the black community never asked for an apology. Neither did I think you were apologizing to the black community. This was you apologizing to your rank and file for a series of information that we have been saying to you for decades that has been happening on the ground. And now you were mandated to actually do your own investigation, your own data collection, your own process internally that actually reveal everything we have been saying in respect to, the everyday violence of your police officers on the streets, the everyday violence of police that has been deployed into black communities in the cities, the everyday violence and strip searching of women and racialized people at different points in public. This has been going on. I documented that in the 90s, in 1990. I documented that here under Bill Blair, that there was strip searching of women. This, and I'll say to you, Chief Raymer, you talk about it being a painful and a hurtful process to your police officers, but this is insulting to black people. This is insulting to Indigenous people. This is insulting to racialized people. This is insulting to the homeless, to those of us who are queer and trans, who are, last year, we experienced the attacks on people in encampment sites. We experienced the brutality. We have been calling for defunding. We have been calling for having that funds be divested to communities to create sustainable housing, to create sustainable community resources and services by the community to support communities. None of that has happened. What have we witnessed? An escalation in policing budget, a deployment of more police to communities in the form of community policing, which we have already said does not work. In fact, it puts us more at risk, right? This is not about saving our lives. What we have asked for you to do is to stop brutalizing us, to stop killing us, to stop carding us, to stop continuously stopping us and harassing our children, or black sons or black daughters. That's what we have asked for. We have asked for the preservation of our lives. And what we have gotten instead is much more police. Yes, your police officers are responsible for their racism. When you talk about systemic change and you talk about the system, you make it seem as though it's a structure that's somehow a separate entity from that of what is happening on the ground, right? It is not a separate, you're culpable, you're implicated, right? Your police officers are doing the job. They are the foot soldiers. They're the ones you deploy on the ground. They're the ones who we interface with, and they are the ones who put our lives at risk. So to say that this isn't about them, and to say that this isn't about their practice, and that they cannot be held accountable and culpable, and that the policies that you have in place to hold police accountable internally is not actually sufficient, because it's not accountable to us.
Okay. Excuse me, can we give the...
So it's really critical that you hear what I'm saying and that you understand. And sorry, I need to go on, please. This is an apology to black people, right?
Thank you. It's supposed to be
You're interrupting me? No. So it's really significant that you understand. You have not tell us how you're going to stop the violence against us. You have not told us how you're going to stop the killing of our people. You have not said how we can be sure that we can walk the streets safely and not being stopped. You have not said anything about that. In fact, what we have witnessed is what is going to continue. So I have one last thing to say. This is the performance of a patriarch. the performance of a heteropatriarchal institution and a bunch of heteropatriarchs who are saying to you, I have been beating you and killing you for decades, and I'm sorry, but I am not going to stop. Right? And you're going to still, and you're going to still continue to forgive me. This is my way of saying you're going to forgive me, and you're going to allow me to continue to do what I need to do, right? But I am not going to stop being and doing what I have been doing. So, Chief Raymer, we do not accept your apology.
Thank you. Chief, you may respond.
Yeah, I wanted to comment and just simply say that I realize it's a very difficult and important day. And we are making concerted efforts to move forward in a productive way. When we talk about the membership and, we talk about systemic racism, I use examples like the TAVIS program. I use examples like the way we were doing strip searches. These were all things that were mandated by the organization and not by individual members. And they have now, take steps to correct them. And this is how we're trying to eliminate all forms of systemic racism, and so that we become a better organization. And that's what makes this important. And as I indicated, there are 38 action items that we are going to do moving forward, like our anti-Black racism and Indigenous experience training, the mandating of a review of body-worn cameras for all use of force incidents. These are a couple of the 38 action items that have been developed in consultation with our community advisory panel. And these are all efforts to help us do this better and to eliminate the systemic racism that is creating some of these problems.
Thank you, Chief. Okay, we're going to continue with media questions, and our guests here will try to facilitate your questions after as well. Next up, I said we have Corey from CTV News.
Chief Raymer.
Take up from Corey there. I did ask this question to some extent, but in fact, I agree with you. What impact is this review going to have on any complaints that you're facing now with racist officers in the time period of the study? And are you going to use this and analyze this to find out any patterns that might point to any specific officers that might not have been caught already in the complaint process?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, I think going forward, it's going to allow us to identify areas in the organization where we're having problems. Having said that, though, as is required by the Anti-Racism Act and the Privacy Commission as well, the data has to be anonymized. So that's why it speaks to systemic racism. But what's happening is by doing the analysis that we've done, it's going to allow us to specifically examine, develop processes, and measure them to see if they're working, and do that in conjunction with the community. And that's the key part. Some of their lived experience will be important in helping us identify how we have to change how we're doing business. So I want to emphasize again that the examples of overt racism are not going to be tolerated. We had an example, I believe it was in 2018, 2019 at the van attack. We had an officer make a comment. Another officer reported it to a supervisor. That was reported up, it went to the tribunal. The officer who made the allegation resigned. That's what our membership is prepared to do. They will not tolerate those examples of overt racism. But again, here, we're talking about trying to correct systemic problems that are going to allow us to build more trust with our community and do our jobs better.
This is your data, it's your officers.
That's correct.
Why not analyze the full picture and learn everything you can? Why anonymize?
Because that's what's required by the Anti-Racism Act and the policy that's been enacted by the board. And it refers to anonymized data. It's about systemic racism. It's not about the acts of an individual. Individual acts of officers can be reported by the people that are offended by it, by other officers who witness it, by third parties who witness it. We have body-worn camera now on all the officers that need to be on when they are engaged with the public. There's avenues to investigate and evaluate the conduct of each and every member that's out in the service there in terms of their interactions.
Thank you. Next up, we have Wendy Gillis from the Toronto Star.
Thank you so much.
so long, Toronto Police did not collect race-based data. There was a reticence to do so, and the use of force data that was collected that you're releasing today was mandated by the province. I'm wondering if you're concerned that the not collecting individual data that shows the individual acts of police officers is an example of the police service refusing to collect information that is really vital to this city.
Actually, I mean, it's a good question, Wendy, but the reality is the act itself requires us to look at it from a systemic point of view and to not go by individual actions for the purposes of this analysis. There are other means to address the individual conduct of officers, and that's by the observations by other officers who are there. It's part of the reasons, one of the things we've done is the change is having an active bystandership program that we're running at our police college, so that the incident like I referred to earlier in 2018 after the van attack, so that officers are aware and they feel confident to report officers that are acting in an inappropriate way. But again, there's many avenues for the public to still complain about overt racism or inappropriate behavior, and we have now more tools to actually investigate that.
Just as a follow-up, I'm wondering if you're going to be looking at the overrepresentation of use of force against Black people within divisions. There are some real stark differences between, different places in the city, Scarborough versus, downtown core. Are you concerned about that, and will you be looking more closely at that?
Yes, and actually that's another good question. If you recall from some of the later statements in my comments, I referenced the part that as we move forward here and we're doing this analysis, we want to be able to identify those and ensure that at all levels of the organization. So from the staff superintendents, the staff sergeants in the divisions, there is a performance criteria that they need to meet to ensure that everybody across the city, no matter what division you are in, is being treated the same. And so that's what this analysis is going to allow us to do, particularly as we go forward. We're going to start looking at arrest data, mental health apprehensions, and youth diversion. And as we start examining that data, and again, in conjunction with the community, we will develop processes that are going to help to identify where we're falling down and put the reforms in place, and then we can measure them and we can evaluate them. And that's what we're going to do. And we're going to continue with the training of our members as well. And as I said, programs like active bystandership are so important. You're seeing more and more of it across North America. And it's to give members the confidence to say something that the public, I think, was always concerned about. Is this, if something happens, is an officer going to say anything when somebody is behaving badly? And that's what we're trying to ensure our members are doing. And this is a much younger organization as we move forward. They are better trained. We are doing incredible amounts of anti-racism training, Indigenous experience training at all levels of the organization. Our new recruits, our coach officers, we're bringing people from the community with expertise inside to provide that training. It's getting better all the time, and we are going to make our best effort to make sure we do this right. And I have to tell you, across my command team, we will not tolerate overt racism.
Thank you, Chief. Next up, we have Jamie from CP24, if you have a question.
Hi, Chief. Members of the Black community, Indigenous communities, racialized communities, they've heard apologies before. They've heard, talk about wanting to do better in servicing these communities better. But and for many people who are listening to today's apology and recommendations, they might be saying, "Oh, we've heard this before." I want to know a year from now, is there going to be any kind of review whether or not the recommendations and what you guys are suggesting today are going to be put in place, and if at the end of a year from now, we still get the complaints that these communities are being disproportionately overcharged, arrested, strip searched, use of force. What are the consequences going to be? What are the concrete actions from Toronto Police to make sure that, hey, listen, we put out these recommendations, we didn't do a good enough job. What do you want to see a year from now if these recommendations aren't implemented?
You know what, that's a good question too, but what I want to emphasize again from my comments is that this is a continuous cycle of improvement. So the reality is we're going to keep doing more and more of this analysis that's going to allow us to identify the deficiencies and correct them. And the community and the public will be able to hold us to account because first of all, the public and the community will be doing this in partnership with us. We will be reporting it on our website, keeping it updated. We will make these changes. And if we identify officers as a result of this that are constantly finding themselves in a situation of inappropriate behavior, that will be addressed as well. But like I say, the vast majority of what we're talking about here is systemic problems in the organization of policing. And like I said, I want to also acknowledge, like these systemic problems exist in other organizations, other government, and that's not to make excuses, but I'm just talking about how pervasive the problem is and the degree and the need to fix it.
I also just want to get your comments. You know, part of the Ontario Human Rights Commission report indicated that the Black community specifically was disproportionately arrested, subjected to use of force, but also charged and overcharging. And the report doesn't necessarily address this issue, which oftentimes sees the police and the courts lay more serious charges than the circumstances suggest that should be. And that forces the accused oftentimes to plead down to a lesser charge, leading to an increase in convictions. I just want to get your take on that, and what's the approach from Toronto Police when it comes to overcharging?
Well, we're in the midst of collaborating with the OHRC now, and there will be a final report that comes out, hopefully, and I believe later in the year, that's going to address some of these issues. And we're having some consultations with this. Some of the processes in which take place, we have to truly evaluate them and make sure we're getting good insight and opinion on how that works from Crown attorneys as well, because it's not sometimes as simple, I think, as you've noted it there. I mean, quite often, that's what the Crown process is the Crowns get the charge and they get to evaluate what are the appropriate charges, and they'll make the decision to make sure that there's particular charges that are the appropriate charges to proceed on, and perhaps these other charges are not. And that's not a criticism. It doesn't reflect on the individual or the accused that's been charged. It's really, in many ways, part of the process. And so there's different, I think, perspectives on that. But we certainly are supportive of looking at any ways that we can improve that process. And all I'm saying is that we're going to have more examination and consultation on that.
Thank you, Chief. Next up, we have Yannick from CBC Radio Canada. No, we'll go to the next person, Scott Laurie from the Toronto Sun. If you have a question?
Chief, you mentioned other interactions that you might look at beyond strip search. And first one, what are some of those other interactions that you think you might take a look at, and what's the timeline to give information about those?
Okay, well, specifically what we're going to look at is arrests. We're going to look at mental health apprehensions, and I believe we're looking at diversion, so it would be youth diversion. What I'll do is I'll turn that over to Colin Stairs, and perhaps he can give you a better idea of the timing.
Sure. So this is, as we said, is a cyclical continuous improvement process. So we've put a lot of analysis and energy into the race-based data and the strip search data. But in parallel, we've been gathering data in 2021 on arrest diversions and apprehensions. As soon as we are done doing this analysis, we're on to doing the analysis for that. And we're going to keep rolling forward with our community advisory panel. Point out that this is a really different approach than historically with the community advisory panel. This isn't us doing analysis and then bringing it to them. We actively engage in conversations about hypotheses, what we think is going on, what different perspectives are there on the data, and then what further analysis would we like to have to try and answer those questions. And we've really gone to the limits of our data on this analysis, and we intend to do that with the next analysis. So the timeline is roughly over the next year. Because we're doing so much consultation with groups, the community around the questions, answers, et cetera. And because we have to do data cleansing, the timelines are a little bit ragged sometimes.
Chief, just as a follow-up, you mentioned, this is an apology that's painful for the community, for the police service. What do you say to members of the community who, they've been talking about this for so long? They're going to have reservations and doubts as members of the community. How do you reassure them that something is actually going to happen?
It's, again, a good question. And the community, I understand the perspective of the lady earlier as well. And I understand the anger and the frustration. And I'm sorry, I don't know her name, but the anger and frustration. I really do, I can appreciate it. And I can tell you that, when I look at some of the things that we have been trying to do over the last few years, and then we look at 2020 data, and I have to tell you my own disappointment, given all the things that we've been trying to do as an organization, and we were still seeing some of these discrepancies in the data. So what I want to assure you is this, is that, we have done the most extensive analysis of police race-based data in history and worldwide. Toronto Police Service has. We have a dedicated team. We've brought in Dr. Pham. We've done extensive analysis of the use of force and strip search. We've brought in independent experts. They helped align our framework that we were going to use. They completely evaluated our data and wrote their own report. And then we engaged the community and our own members to make sure we are examining social aspects as well as operational aspects. And so I think I say all of that just to try to demonstrate that we are committed to this process. We are committed to this continual cycle of improvement. We are going to continue to analyze data, and we're going to continually find ways to eliminate systemic racism.
Thank you, Chief. Next up, we have Sue Goodspeed from CBC. No, we'll go to Catherine from CBC if you have a question.
Yes, hi. My first question is about the timing. This is data from 2020. Other police services have released some of that, those findings months ago in their annual report, even last year. Why aren't we already looking at the data from 2021? When will that come out, and what action could have been taken within that time frame?
Well, and I'm glad you raised that. I mean, the issue for us was we've gone further than anybody else, number one, and we did have to. What's the technical term? I guess they had to work on our data so that it was usable, and it took some time. And then we did a tremendous amount of community consultation, brought in experts to help us to learn how to develop it, and then we went beyond anybody else in terms of also examining strip search. And so these are some of the reasons for the delay. And is there any more of that?
Sure. Just so what the chief is talking about is the data cleansing that we needed to do. But fundamentally, the race-based data on use of force is part of a provincial form. It's collected on a provincial form that's filled out. Here's the event. The officer fills out the form. So just lifting that data and summarizing it and releasing it is a relatively straightforward job. But that's not what we did. What we did was we took that data and said, how do we find meaning in this data? And we sat down with our community advisory group and asked, what questions would you want to answer out of this data? And when we did that, we had a lot of different hypotheses, questions, et cetera, and we had to combine the race-based data in the use of force with the occurrence data that we have in the rest of the service. That was a very complex process, a very in-depth, and required a lot of careful navigation of the data quality, and could we really rely on some of the data elements that we had. And we had those discussions with some community experts in analysis who are also members of the various communities. And that is of course, why we needed a PhD, Dr. Mai Phan, to take that approach. And Dr. Phan also had several innovations to the approach of analyzing this race-based data. So all of that took a fair amount of time. And there was a decision point where we could have said, we're going to release this like everyone else, but we decided that wasn't actually helpful. we needed to find meaning so that we could create an action plan and so that we could move forward with the 38 points. And even that, we want to have a conversation with community over the summer in a set of town halls and see if we should be modifying even that plan. So that level of consultation is why we are as late compared to our comparators, other services.
My follow-up question is on the reports themselves. So we got access to 1 month worth of those reports from an FOI request, and you addressed a little bit maybe the shortfalls of the form or the cleaning of the data that was necessary. For example, we know at least 2 incidents where the officers did not perceive the suspects with the same ethnicity. The majority or the most often seen weapon from a suspect is the unknown weapon, which sometimes can mean they had something, sometimes can mean they didn't have a weapon at all. Do you have any way that you want to address those perhaps shortfalls? Is it through what you want to collect, Chief, or is it through what the province is asking you to collect? Do you want this form to change?
Can you speak to that? I think it's best Dr. Fenn speaks to it.
Thank you for asking the question about the provincial form. As you noted, there are a lot of issues with how the province collects the information in the form, and we've been having conversations with the province around those limitations and some of the issues that they're going to see when they start to analyze the information that they receive from all police services. The Anti-Racism Act actually mandates the province to collect from all police services and analyze the data in use of force. Unfortunately, the way that it's collected, they are going to unfortunately not be able to distinguish between incidents and individual officer reports. And as you know, there could be more than one officer in an incident, and so they're going to be very much inflated numbers in what the province receives. And so, there are efforts ongoing today to modernize the use of force report form, and hopefully we'll hear from the province and leadership on that.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Momin, 680 News.
You heard what Beverly had to say earlier. You can't see obviously, but in real time, I know there's lots of comments online from members of the Black community who don't put any stock in your apology, don't believe what you have to say, maybe don't even care for what you have to say. So how can the Toronto Police possibly try to regain, even gain any of that trust? I mean, this seems like something that is beyond an uphill climb for your organization.
Actually, you know what? I disagree with you, and I disagree with you because there's an incredible amount of good work being done. I was up at the 31 Division on Saturday for the open house there, and very, very substantial turnout from members of the community working with our neighborhood officers, and just love having those neighborhood officers in the community and working very, very well with them. So much confidence about some of the work that we were doing and the improved interactions with police and the relationships with the police. So from my perspective, I hear a very different voice from the community, and there's a lot of confidence in the work that we are doing. And I'm out there very often. I attend at scenes after something has occurred. I'll be out on a prayer walk in 23 Division this afternoon. And I'll be listening to the community, and I suspect, given today's press conference, we'll get even more feedback. But we're far from perfect. We've got a lot of work to do, and this speaks to it here today. I indicated to you my disappointment with the data, but we are doing a lot of good work, and this is going to get better because now we can actually measure. We can actually measure and hold accountable and make these changes. And quite frankly, you can hold us accountable in a very visible way because it'll be on the website to see how we're meeting the new standards that we put in place.
Chief, how many of the changes that need to be made here have to start with when new recruits walk through the door at the police college? So the very basis start of training. How much of the change has to come from that moment?
It's bringing them in the door. We're constantly adding time to their training. And, sometimes we're reluctant to add too much time. We might want to look at cutting something because we need to add another program because of the amount of time they are in training, and we want to see them operational. But we're starting to realize that we can't make decisions on that basis. and that there's more in training. We're now new recruits, or we're putting them immediately out into field to get into the neighborhoods, so they spend a little more time acclimatizing with the community, learning how to speak with them a little bit, especially this new generation that spends all their time on a phone. And these are some of the things that we're recognizing, and that's lengthening the amount of time. That's lengthening the time before we get them on the road operating calls. And so that is such an important element of what we do going forward, and we're trying to put more and more emphasis on that in terms of time, because it's that important.
Thank you, Chief. Next, we have Rosie from the Star.
You've mentioned several times that the Act mandates you to anonymize the data, or to collect it in an anonymized way. How is it possible, therefore, to hold individuals accountable if you don't know, perhaps, which individuals are most frequently behaving in a manner that you would find disturbing?
Okay, no, I understand your concern. We have, like I say, to your point earlier, this is about systemic racism. That's what we're trying to identify. I just go back to like we have processes in place. We have systems within professional standards that we see officers certain behavior and we're seeing multiple accounts of it. It's identified and they are called in. The circumstances in which they were involved in are evaluated and examined. The unit commanders are held accountable to superiors that review that at a professional standards unit. So we have elements in place to investigate officers if we believe they're performing inappropriately, and we continue to do that. And again, I emphasize, we have, if a member is concerned and they are not confident in what the police are doing, they have the OIPRD, they have the OHRC to go and make that complaint. And if they're involved in the court process and our officers are in court, you have that whole judicial process that quite often, if officers are acting inappropriately, will expose their behavior.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up?
Follow-up then, is there something inherently wrong with the Act then that you might like to see changed so that you could study that data and use it effectively? I'm not even saying releasing it to the public, but at least internally have that information.
I think that we have other avenues within the organization to look at members. I think if you're going to be able to evaluate data effectively and get valuable data in terms of what's happening day in and day out, I think it's important that data is anonymized if you want to get a true picture, so you can get perspective of what's happening. I'd be really concerned about if everything officers were doing, they were always being identified, because I think what would happen is they would become less likely to engage, and that's not a good thing in policing. If we start creating an environment where officers are going to go, well, no, this is just going to mean another a point against me because I'm actually going to this call and I'm engaging this person, that's not a good thing for anyone. So I think we have to rely on our other means of professional standards operations to investigate that, and we have good systems in place, including those that are outside the policing field in terms of the OIPRD. I think the important thing here is identifying the systemic issues and finding ways with the community to fix it.
Thank you, Chief. Next, we're going to go from the Globe and Mail. Dakshana, do you want to ask your question, please?
This is a public so-called service, and you're afraid to be accountable publicly?
Okay, actually, question, thank you. Yeah, we can hear you, go ahead. So that, hey?
DRB heard my question.
Okay, well, no problem, thank you
very much. Well, next goes to Stephen at CBC. Stephen, do you have a question?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this. Chief, I just want to address something that a lot of community groups have been saying about defunding police. Is there a structure in place at some point when you look at all of this, where you can see that some services that the police are doing right now that a lot of community groups say they shouldn't, perhaps could be offloaded to others, or money devoted directly to the community? Because that's a question that was, front and center in 2020, and I'm just wondering if that's something that within all of these processes and this data analysis is even being considered at all?
Well, first of all, what I'd say is I think when we hear that discussion, what they're talking about, the community's talking about is reform, and it's talking about modernization of the police service. The reality is that we are engaged in a number of processes in terms of alternate service delivery, and we want to be engaged in that. We're seeing great advancements in terms of what our call center is doing in terms of diverting call, and with the programs within SafeTO in terms of alternate service delivery. And it is really, we're finding, freeing up officers from calls. So what that's allowing us to do is devote officers and call time to where we're underperforming. We have a significant delay in our response to primary 1 and 2 calls here in this city, and every time we can divert these calls to other specialists to get perhaps a better public safety outcome with specialists, that benefits the entire city and community, because we can get officers doing the other calls that are sometimes sitting for very lengthy periods of time before they're responding. So, and so we very much support that endeavor, and we're continuing to find ways to actually enhance and improve that.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up, Stephen?
No, thank you.
Okay, next we will go to Laurie Goldstein from Postmedia. Laurie, do you have a question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Great. Chief, there's nothing in this data about the crime rates in communities within the police interact. And for very good reason, it's illegal. It's been illegal for decades. But what do you say to people who are going to be cynical about these findings because it doesn't include crime rates in communities within the police interact?
Well, listen, with the greatest of respect, there's a whole host of issues that are impacting crime in the city in Toronto and different areas and of the city. But regardless of where it's happening in the city and the crime, these systemic issues still need to be corrected, regardless of where they are. And that's why the focus is on that. Does it mean that there needs to be more city engagement in an area? Does it mean that there needs to be more community officers in an area? Is there different forms or alternate service delivery that need to be in an area? Hopefully that's why by identifying these systemic issues and having community involvement, we're going to find better ways to do policing. And that's quite frankly what is important here.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up,
And actually, I just might add that, if I may, I think Dr. Pham would have some comments that she'd like to add to that as well, please.
She did it yesterday. I have a follow-up question.
If I could answer your question as well.
You answered it yesterday.
Yes. So I just wanted to address and clarify that in the analysis that we did, we do take into account differential rates of experiencing crime or involvement in enforcement actions that may be seen for different communities. So what we're interested in the analysis is that when we're responding to those incidents that may disproportionately involve different groups of people, are we responding to it in a fair and equitable way with similar use of force outcomes regardless of the race of individuals involved? And so underlying the analysis is taking into account those issues, but we are very careful not to speak about differential offending rates, as you put it, because that is language that is typically used to criminalize communities and groups. It lends itself to potentially stigmatizing people for experiencing vulnerabilities in our society as a result of structural barriers and historical systems of oppressions. And so we are really careful not to go down that line, but the analysis focuses on whether there are fair treatment when we are responding to those incidents and responding to community needs.
Thank you, Dr. Pham. Laurie, do you want to go ahead with your follow-up?
Yes, I do. This issue is not an issue that's radical in this kind of research. Let me quote from a study by the Ontario Human Rights Commission. criminologist Scott Wortley of U of T and Maria Young of Ryerson University. They talk about the two theories of the crime. One they refer to as the higher rate of offending thesis, which maintains that certain people engage in criminal activity at a higher level than other racial groups, and this fact is accurately reflected in official crime statistics. Then there's the second theory, which is the bias theory, which argues that black people are overrepresented in police statistics because they're subject to biased or discriminatory treatment by the police of the broader criminal justice system. And they argue rates of black offending stem from, this can stem from negative consequences of colonialism, slavery, and all those things. Those authors said that there's growing evidence that suggests that both explanations have merit, that the overrepresentation of blacks in arrest statistics may be caused by both higher rates of offending and racial bias within the criminal justice system. And so what, again, I'm asking is, what do you say to people who go, you're only looking at half of the issue?
Thank you for asking that question and for bringing up the competing hypotheses. It is...
I'm asking the Chief.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, I'm going to let Dr. Pham answer that one.
Okay.
I am the expert hired to do this analysis, so thank you for listening to my responses. The multiple benchmark approach, if you take the time to read the report, I hope you will see the value of the approach that we took and the innovation that we took in order to answer precisely those two competing hypotheses about what is contributing to racial disproportionalities in policing outcomes. The multiple benchmark approach helps us to tease apart what is the role of policing in contributing to those disparate outcomes, and what are the other factors, including the upstream effects of systemic systems of discrimination that exists in other areas of society that may be feeding into and contributing to those outcomes. And so the approach we took helps us to identify our role in contributing to disparities in use of force and strip search outcomes, but it also identifies areas where we need to work with other organizations and other sectors to address more of the upstream effects. And that means working with communities as well to help understand what are their unique needs, what are the challenges they're experiencing, and how can we work together to provide healthier communities, support safer communities together.
Thank you, Dr. Pham. We'll now go to Lorenda at CBC. Lorenda, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. This is for the Chief. This data was collected as communities were calling for defunding. When I look at the changes being called for, though, the recommendations, for example, mandating a review of body-worn cameras, do you reckon that this will all result in actually calls for more funding for police?
No, actually, the review of the body-worn camera is something that we do internally with supervisors. And it's just mandating that when there's a use of force occurrence, and it needs to, that must be captured on your body cam, needs to be on, then that's reviewed to make sure that there's nothing inappropriate that's occurred during that interaction. We've done a bit of a realignment with our staffing, and divisions are now going to have a compliance officer, and we hope to enhance more of that video review into other circumstances that occur, just to get a better idea of what's happening and to make sure officers are behaving appropriately.
And do you have a follow-up, Lorenda?
Could I just first have a clarification on that before I get to my follow-up? I meant it sort of more in general, and that was one example. Do you think that this could result in calls for a larger police budget?
The budget issue is something that goes on each and every year. We cannot ignore the fact that this is the fastest growing city in North America, and the population keeps rising, and there will be, and I've indicated that in my budget pronouncements, there'll be additional needs for more police officers in the future just by virtue of demand.
Okay, and to my follow-up, I appreciate that. This is for a colleague, and I apologize that I'm kind of taking us away from this, but there was another important report that was also released today. That was from the Attorney General on the 911 Communication Center audit. It recommends increasing staffing levels given the high number of calls and the fact that some people are waiting on hold for as long as 10 minutes. What is your reaction to those findings, and do you plan on increasing or supporting staff?
Well, that report is going to go to the board and the city. What I think is important to understand is that ordinarily the Auditor General does not have an opportunity to come in and examine the police department because we are overseen by the Police Services Act. I signed an MOU for the Auditor General and the board with the board to come in and allow them to come and fully examine our 911 communications operations. So we provided her every piece of data that she was looking at and interested in, and she's now written a report that'll go to the board and ultimately the city for review, and those discussions will happen at that point.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who attended today. That concludes our news conference.